Well, thank you, Captain Lovell, for joining us today and reminiscing about Apollo 13, whose 50th anniversary is coming up quickly. And we had several questions we wanted to run through about the mission and your reactions to everything that transpired during Apollo 13. My first question is, Apollo 13 was going to be the third moon landing. Could you talk a little bit about the objectives of your mission and how it differed from Apollo 11?
Well, actually, this was the first time that we were really going for exploration or discovery. The first Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 were merely the machines to say, hey, we can do the job, here it is, and 12 followed up that 11 was just not a fluke, that actually 12 could do the same thing. But by the time 13 came around, they didn't worry so much about the transition and the mechanics of getting to the moon. What the scientists were now looking at was the moon itself, looking at more things. So we were going to a place called Fra Mauro. And Fra Mauro was supposed to be a very informative place with different kind of materials than 11 or 12 picked up. And that was our whole objective. And so that's what we trained for. And unfortunately, we didn't make it.
I understand your crew was originally scheduled to fly on Apollo 14 and not 13, but NASA rejected Deke Slayton's recommendation for the Apollo 13 crew and thus bumped you up. I was wondering, how did you feel about that at the time, and how do you feel looking back on that in retrospect now?
Well, it was kind of interesting. After Apollo 8, and then we watched Apollo 11, I was the backup to Neil on Apollo 11. And then I was assigned Apollo 14, so we started training for that. But the NASA management determined that Al Shepard didn't have enough training. He was grounded for some time. And so one day Deke came in and said, look, we want to put you on 13 rather than 14. And I thought that would be fine. I mean, we'd be coming up 6 months or sometime earlier and do that, and it'd be an earlier flight. And went home and I told my wife, ma'am, we're going to go on 13, not 14. And she said, 13? She said, yeah. I said, well, it comes after 12, and then they put that in the movie.
And how do you feel about that looking back now, having been on 13?
Well, being in the government and NASA, we don't believe in myths like Apollo, like the number 13. But it did have, as you look at the flight and you analyze the mission from its inception to the finality of it, you'll see that it was plagued by bad omens and bad luck from the very beginning. And one by one, now that I look back on it, I could see the things that occurred that told me that, hey, something's going to happen here.
Can you mention a few of those things?
Yeah, well, first of all, we were getting all squared away to check things out, and during the countdown demonstration test, which is 2 weeks before the flight, and we have the spacecraft loaded with fuel and things of this nature, and the test was completed. Everything worked fine for launching the vehicle. We left, and the ground crew went in to secure the spacecraft. One of their jobs was to remove the liquid oxygen from the 2 liquid oxygen tanks that were in the spacecraft. The way they did it, they put gaseous oxygen or gas in the fill line and forced it out the vent line through a system in the tank itself, the plumbing, that allowed you to do that. But years before the flight, this tank had been dropped on the factory. Now, they tested it out for everything it had to do to supply oxygen to the spacecraft, but they failed to look at the lunar mechanisms and the tubing to remove the oxygen after a routine test. And so when the flight crew, after the last test, just 2 weeks before the flight, tried to remove the oxygen, they couldn't do it. And so they looked at the schematics of the tank, and they said, well, wait a second, this tank has a heater on it. and also look at we should just apply the ground power, because we have ground power at the launch site, 65-volt ground power, while the spacecraft flew at 28-volt power. And they applied the 65-volt power to the oxygen tank's heater system, and as they predicted, it worked out. They boiled the oxygen out of the tank, made everything all squared away, all set to go. But what they didn't know, as the temperature in the tank got up to about close to 80 degrees, which is kind of unusual for liquid oxygen, quickly, the little thermostat was going to open up to shut off the power and keep the heat down. But when it came up, the higher voltage welded those contacts shut, and from then on we had no safety. As it turned out, the temperature got really up to 300 or 400 degrees. Ground crew never knew it. Oxygen was all removed. Believe it, the tank didn't explode for some strange reason, although the oxygen got out. And so the tank, but the day before the flight, the tank was put liquid oxygen back into it, and from then on it was a bomb waiting to go off. But the anomaly of this whole thing was, back in 1985, I think it was, the manufacturer of the spacecraft told the manufacturer of the liquid oxygen tank to change the circuit breakers or the thermostats from being compatible for 28 volt to 65 volt. They did not do it. They did not do it. And then what made things worse is that the manufacturer didn't double check his directive to do it. And consequently, it damaged the tank, and then, 200,000 miles out, on April 13, the tank exploded. And of course, other omens were the fact we had measles just before the takeoff, and Jack Swikard had replaced Ken Mattingly. So these are the things that led up to Apollo 13 to be unusual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in retrospect, it sounds quite interesting. And a little bit getting on with that same line of thought, the Apollo 13 liftoff started flawlessly, but the center engine on the Saturn V's second stage shut down about 2 minutes early. Did you have concerns at that point whether you'd be able to reach the moon?
Yes, we did. Suddenly, the center engine shut down. I think 1 minute or 2 minutes early, and we had that big light beaming at us, and we said, "Boy, what's the story?" Well, it turned out that on the third stage we had enough fuel to to get into Earth orbit, and then go around, and with enough fuel left to the third stage to give us the velocity to go to the moon. But that was another little bad omen. And the funny thing is, on one of the unmanned Saturn V, there were 2 unmanned Saturn V launches, that same thing had occurred, and they thought they had everything all squared away by that time. And of course, on 8 and 10 and 11, everything worked fine.
Sure. Well, this was your second trip to the moon and your 4th flight overall. Were you used to the sights and the sounds and even the smells of space?
Yes, I got to be old hat with me. I mean, I felt very comfortable on 13 to start out with, knowing some of the items I had. I learned to navigate on Apollo 8, and and it turns out that Swikard was very competent. He happened to be the fellow that helped develop the command module manual for any kind of problems that they had, a problem manual. So I felt very, comfortable with him.
And I imagine being familiar with that kind of thing helped because you were on the mission with 2 rookies.
Yeah.
Can you describe your reaction, getting onto the interesting stuff now, can you describe your reaction when you heard the loud bang that resulted from the oxygen tank exploding?
Well, first of all, we did know. I heard a loud bang, and the funny thing is, during our test phases, while we were in the spacecraft, Fred Hayes made things kind of funny. He would pull out, I think it was an oxygen valve or some sort. It sort of gave a bang too. And I thought at first, because that was Fred, that why is he doing that again? And then I looked up at him. I had been down on the command module, and looked up at him, and he had his eyes were as wide as saucers, and I could tell he says, "It's not me." And then, of course, things started to happen.
And when you saw the gas venting from the command module, how quickly did you realize that this was something major?
Well, before I saw that we lost 2 out of 3 fuel cells. And I knew that one fuel cell would give us enough electrical power to just get around the moon and back home again. But then I looked up on the instrument panel and I saw the quantity gauges of the 2 fuel cells in the service module. And one fuel was 0. And the other fuel cell started to go down like this ever so slightly, but something you would never see in the normal uses of oxygen on a flight to the moon. And then I went out to the side window, and I can't tell you today why I did it, but when I looked out the window, I saw escaping at the rear end of my spacecraft in sort of a flame or a fume type of thing, a gaseous substance. And I realized quickly that that gas I saw coming out was the oxygen, and that I had lost both fuel cells. Or oxygen tanks. I lost both oxygen tanks. So the explosion ruptured part of the second tank too, which was not damaged by the factory crew when they dropped it.
Mm-hmm. So how did you hold your composure in such an extraordinary and unprecedented moment of crisis?
Well, when you're in a situation like this, I could have bounced off the walls, for 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do. And then nothing would have changed. And so, and remember that the crew was, former test pilots. So I had been used to an engine quitting occasionally and testing airplanes and things like that. So we finally had to decide what to do. And we knew quite quickly that we were in a dying vehicle and that we were going to have to go into the lunar module. Because it was the only thing that still had oxygen tanks, because with the loss of electrical power, we lose our rocket engine on the command module. So it was going to be dead, and which was exactly what happened. And we discussed it finally. I forget exactly when we got to talk to the ground. The ground at first thought that this was a communications problem. That somehow we're interrupted by the radio waves or something like that, or for the rays coming from the sun or something of this nature, and giving all these false indications on their consoles down there. But we knew what the story was right from the beginning, and so they finally agreed that that was the case. Let's go in the lunar module, and the first thing we did, which was very, very fortunate, we took the guidance parameters out of the guidance system and put them into the guidance system into the lunar module. So the guidance system, the command module, knew our attitude with respect to the celestial sphere. So we got that information back into the lunar module's guidance system, which was dead. We had to fire it up and put it in. So we knew then in the lunar module what our attitude was, so that we could use the lunar module later on with its engine to maneuver to different attitudes.
Mm-hmm. Well, at this stage, you'd already performed a mid-course correction to get off the free return trajectory onto a better path for landing near Fra Mauro. How quickly did Mission Control figure out how to get you back onto that free return trajectory and to speed the spacecraft up to get you home earlier?
It took a little while, but that was the first thing they thought of. It's kind of interesting. We started out to the moon on a free return course, which essentially meant that if our engine quit in the service module, that we were on a course that would take us all the way to the moon, and it was pretty accurate. With the help of the moon's gravity, we'd switch around and come back on a course back to the Earth that would be in such an attitude that we could cut into the Earth's atmosphere. That pie-shaped wedge is only between, 2 and 3 degrees or something like that we had to go through there. It's a 2-degree pie-shaped wedge. But then about I don't know, 20 hours after we were taken off going from the Earth to the moon, they called up and said, look, we have looked at your situation when you get around to starting to go down to land at Fra Mauro, and we've kind of figured out that the sun is going to be ready just above you. And so it's going to wipe out everything down below. You're going to be like, landing in a saucer of milk. So we're going to get you off that free return and put you on a course that when we get around to start landing, you'll start to see the craters and the shadows and things like that. So that's fine. And then, of course, when the accident occurred, we were in a position that had we not gotten off that course, going around the moon, coming back to the Earth, we would miss the Earth completely, and we'd end up in a long elliptical orbit all the way back out to where the moon was, back into where the Earth was, back there, I don't know, for years, I guess.
Sounds a little scary. And one consequence of the free return trajectory was that you set a record for the farthest humans have ever been from Earth. Did you realize that at the time? And or were you too preoccupied with the tasks at hand?
No, we didn't. Although when we came around and at the apogee, because this time we didn't slow down, of course, we let the apogee take us back again. I looked back at the moon and I could see that it's not the one I saw in Apollo 8. It's a lot smaller. And with that regards, though, that I knew that that's fine with me because I know we're not going to slow down either. So I've got the velocity to not get captured by the moon to get back home again.
That's good. The lunar module obviously was never designed to operate as a lifeboat, and using it was truly unprecedented. How difficult was it to operate and maneuver the lunar module, running the engines and using that to navigate back home?
Well, normally a lunar module is like any other vehicle. I mean, when you do things, when you do the controls, they'll go the way they were designed to do, and you learned it that way. But when the explosion occurred, and we had to use the lunar module, but we needed the command module and its heat shield to get back into the atmosphere. So what happened when I first tried to maneuver the vehicle before we got to the moon to get back on that free return course, and the ground gave us the particular attitudes to do it to, so I started to maneuver in the normal way. It didn't work. The center of gravity, instead of being in the center of the lunar module like it's normal, was way out in left field someplace. And if I wanted to go right, it went someplace else. If I wanted to go left, it was so I literally had to learn by the maneuvering how to maneuver or how to place my controller to get to the proper position. And it took a little while for me to do that. But fortunately, when you're in deep trouble, you learn pretty fast.
That's always good. I was curious how the communications between you and Mission Control worked. You were obviously working on the immediate crisis while they were planning ahead for how to get you safely home. What was that dynamic like, talking to them and working things out?
It was pretty good. In the beginning, though, after we got on this, they knew we had to get back on the free return. But they were now determining what should we do. I mean, there was some talk about, well, we had a procedure in the computer to slow down and come back again, but we didn't think that the lunar module's fuel system would handle all that. And so they were debating what to do back and forth as we were going towards the moon. But we talked back and forth, without the mission control, I think that we wouldn't be talking today.
I gather the communications were difficult too because the spent rocket fuel was designed to crash into the moon so that the seismometer from Apollo 12 could read it, and that was on the same frequency as you were. So
yeah, that was the problem too, and they. And of course, we got rid of the service module. No, not the service module. It was the third stage of the booster that was going to crash on the moon.
Is it true that Jack and Fred were captivated with taking photos of the lunar far side?
Yeah. Well, after we got back on the free return course, the ground came up again and said, look, we've analyzed your situation and the amount of electrical power you have on the lunar module, and it's really touch and go. And we don't think we think you'll run out before you get back, and you're going to have electrical power to get your final position for landing, and so we're going to speed you up. And so this was on the way to the moon, and so we have a crew down on the simulators now working out the directions. And then as we got closer and closer to the moon, oh, by the way, they said, when you get behind the moon now, you lose communication with us, so be sure you're ready to copy. And I said, well, yeah, I have my two companions, and if I miss something to copy on this next procedure, I'm sure they'll pick it up. And so as we got very close to the moon, they called up and said, are you ready to copy? And I said, I am, and I started to copy. And I looked at my companions. They weren't paying any attention. They had cameras in their hands. Can you imagine the cameras in their hands? And I said, gentlemen, what are your plans here? And they said, well, as we go around the far side of the moon, we're going to take some pictures. And I said, if we don't get home, you won't get them developed. But I got the procedures, they got their photographs, and so we came home.
Everyone was happy. And how ill did Fred get on the trip back home? Was that a major concern for you? How ill Fred got?
Oh,
on the way
sick?
back home?
Yeah, he got an infection, a bladder infection, I think, and he got the chills and things like that. I try to keep him warm every once in a while. I'd give him a bear hug and try to keep him with my body, and but he hung in there, fortunately, and it was the temperatures kept dropping slowly. At first, we didn't notice it because but we were turning off all the electronic equipment that provided the heat to balance the temperature inside the spacecraft. And finally, when all that stuff was down, it got kind of cold in there, and so. But he hung in.
Yeah, that's good. And what were your thoughts as you splashed down in the Pacific and knew that you had made it home safely?
Well, of course, it was one of pure delight. We were coming back in, and we got through that one other big problem that we had, that we were being poisoned by our own exhalation. The environmental system in the lunar module had just one canister to remove carbon dioxide, and it was designed only for 2 guys for 2 days, and we were 3 guys for 4 days. And so we had to figure out a way of getting rid of the carbon dioxide, which Mission Control did. They figured out a way of taking a canister from the dead command module, which was square, trying to fit it into a round hole, which we finally did with duct tape and everything of that nature, and it worked. This was a miraculous thing, because if that didn't happen, that carbon dioxide was building up, and I don't know what would happen then.
Sure. And one final question on a somewhat lighter note. What was the experience like working on the Apollo 13 film and appearing in it, as well as your association with making the film?
It was kind of interesting. As a matter of fact, just after we finally landed and we got on the Iwo Jima and we're dusting ourselves off, and Fred got into sick bay, and we went down to see him, and we're sitting around talking, and we said, you know something? This is an unusual flight. I mean, look what happened, the measles and all the things that happened and all that. This would make it, we'll write a book about it. And so we decided, well, maybe that's a good idea. I talked to Jack Swiken at that time and Fred Hayes, and nothing happened for a while. The days went by, or years went by, actually. And then a fellow by the name of Jeff Kluger called up. He was a writer for the Discover magazine. And he said, I've always wanted to write a story on NASA and the space program, and on 13 I thought was the way to go. And I said, that's what we've been thinking about. But by that time, Fred had a job with Grumman, and so he wasn't interested, and Jack had died. He had died leukemia, I think it was, anyway, which was a shame. And I said, well, let's do it. I said, we'll split, we'll go 50-50, and I'll be the guy that gives up the information. I liked his writing. And so that's what we did. That's what came up with, started out to be Lost Moon, and then the movie people said, well, listen, Apollo 13 is much more good than Lost Moon on a movie. So we went out to see Ron Howard. It's kind of funny how this got started, too. Because we were writing the book. We hadn't finished the book yet, and when our publisher, or our, not the publisher, but I forget the people in between. The
agent, maybe?
Agent is the person. Said, look, there's some interest in the movies for it. And so I got a call from Ron Howard. Could you come out and talk to me about this particular story? It turned out that the son of a flight controller also worked for Ron Howard, and his job was to go through all the books and the scripts and everything that people handed him to see if they're worthwhile making a movie. And he saw this manuscript, which was not completed, and he went to Ron Howard and he said, look at this, I think this would be kind of interesting. And so Fred and I went up and talked to him, and that's how it all got started.
Yeah. And
Jeff and I.
Perhaps probably from the Apollo 13 film as well as from your getting safely back home, I think in most people's minds, Apollo 13 is right up there with just maybe a little bit below Apollo 11 in terms of what people remember about the Apollo program. How does it feel to be part of something that didn't work, but in the end ended up becoming even more famous?
Well, it did become more famous at the beginning, at least in the eyes of NASA. I'll have to tell you an interesting story. We came back. It's a failure. And obviously there's some human purposes that made this a failure when they finally did the analysis. So the spacecraft, the command module, which was the only thing left of Apollo 13 really, was in a warehouse down in Florida for about 6 months. And then they tried to forget about it. They wanted to go on to Apollo 14 and everything like that. Then France called up, Paris called up, a museum, Le Bourget, which was where Lindbergh landed. And they asked the Smithsonian, do you have any space artifacts that we could have in this museum? And then the lights came on in the Smithsonian and also NASA. Well, we get rid of this spacecraft. So they exiled Apollo 13 to Le Bourget, and it stayed there for 20 years. And about 18 years before that, or after that, I had a classmate that went out there, and he saw it, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, do you know where your spacecraft is? And I didn't at that time. No one told me it was in Le Bourget. And then later on, a year or so later, my wife and I were in Paris, and we went out to this museum, which was at the airfield there, and there we saw it. We walked up to it. It was still on the cradle that they had rolled it in. It was all by itself, just about. Nothing else around it. The catch was missing. The instrument panel was missing. The seats were missing. And the only thing I saw was on the side was a piece of paper that was stuck on the side that said Apollo 13 and gave the names of the 3 crew members. And I thought, well, you know, it was all dusty, you know, and then Ron Howard made the movie. And of course they made the movie that was shown in France. And all those French people said, oh, that's out there in Le Bourget, let's go see it. Meanwhile, NASA was so embarrassed in the Smithsonian that the museum out of Hutchinson, Kansas, called the Cosmosphere, offered to go get that and bring it back and pay for it. And they did. And all those Frenchmen now were mad because they had kept it for 20 years, and now it came back here.
That's a good story. Well, I think that was all the questions I had. I'm not sure if Dave or any of the other people have a quick follow-up that they want to ask.
I think we're good. What, you guys, do you have any questions?
No, yeah.
Can I ask one?
Sure, of course.
Jim, you had a long career with the space program. Can you give me some of your favorite things? What were some of the things you loved about the job, that you loved about the experience?
Well, first of all, you have to look a little bit at my background. I was my father died when I was a youngster, and my mother and I lived together in a small apartment, and there was no way as I was in high school that I was going to go to college. I was very much interested, though, in rockets, because I had gone to high school during the World War II. And towards the end of World War II, we learned a lot about what the Germans were doing. I learned a lot what was happening here with Dr. Goddard and what he was trying to do. I read a book, or I tried to read a book that Goddard wrote back in 1913 of the development or the method of reaching extreme altitudes, which was using liquid fuel rockets to do that. That was 1913. I didn't understand half of it, but I thought, and I wanted to become a rocket engineer. So I wrote to the American Rocket Society, said, how do I do that? And they wrote back a very nice letter, but essentially what it said at the end, get a good education. Go to MIT, they suggested, or Caltech. I couldn't afford any of that. I also applied for the Naval Academy at that time, because there I could get in without having to pay a lot of money. And my uncle was out of the class of 13 at the Naval Academy. And so I wrote back there, and I got a letter back saying I was third alternate. Things looked pretty slim, pretty bad. And then something happened, like a window opening up, or a door that if you start walking through it, it turns out that the Navy was short of naval aviators after World War II. They had all these carriers, but most of the people that trained for naval aviation didn't want to stay in the Navy after the war. They did a good job during the war. They came back, and they all left to do other things. The Navy was short of naval aviators. And so Bupers, and Admiral Holloway was his name, came up with a plan. Let's take high school seniors, if they're interested in naval aviation, and if they pass physicals and things like that, we'll send them to college for 2 years. Has to be an engineering course, but we'll send them to college for 2 years. And if they pass and they look good like that, we'll send them down to Pensacola and get their wings and get them in flight training. That's about 14 months. And when they go down there, they'll be aviation midshipmen. And if they get their wings and are all squared away, we'll send them out to a squadron or to a base someplace for about 6 months to make sure they get acclimated to that. And then we'll send them back to their college for their last 2 years. So they'll get a 4-year education. They'll be naval aviators. And I couldn't believe it. I said, oh my gosh. I applied as, really tripping over myself. So I got accepted. I went to Wisconsin for 2 years, which was about 1.5 years because the Navy doesn't believe in holidays. and then I went down to Pensacola. But while I was at the Naval Academy, or while I was at Wisconsin, my mother, thinking ahead, said, these government programs, sometimes they can stop them anytime they want to. Now, you're in college right now, and that's really great, but maybe the Navy suddenly realizes that they have enough naval aviators. They don't need any more, and they'll just shut the program down. So why don't you call or apply one more time to the Naval Academy? So I did. While I was at Wisconsin, I applied one more time. And I got the results back this time. I was now first alternate. That's why I said, that's the end of that deal. And so I did go down after my 2 years at Wisconsin, went down to into the Holloway program, it's called, started ground training before you start your flying. And about 1.5 months through ground training, I suddenly got orders from the Naval Department, and these were not mandatory orders. These were said, if you still want to go to the Naval Academy, go up and check in at Annapolis. Couldn't believe it. Now I was in a quandary. And the young Marine officers who were doing some of the training came to me and said, Jim, you know, you have 2 years of college. You're in naval aviation. Isn't that what you wanted? And then you get your last 2 years of college. You have college education, you have a job and everything. I said, you're absolutely right. I said, that's ridiculous. But then the skipper of ground training called me in. He's an old four-striper, I think, that was training pilots since the Revolution. And he said, son, he said, you want to make your Navy your career? Yes, sir. He said, get your ass up to the Naval Academy. Get your training while you can get it. You never know what's going to happen. So I did. Packed my bags, went up to the Naval Academy, checked in a blue uniform that was strictly a midshipman's uniform because we had them down there too. They couldn't believe who I was. They had discharged me as an aviation midshipman and then re-swear me in as a midshipman. And that's how it all started.
So actually, Jim, if you don't mind, I have one quick question as well. And I was just kind of curious, what do you, I mean, 50 years on, it may be tough, but do you recall what the first thing you and Marilyn kind of talked about once you returned after Apollo 13 was? What did that conversation go like, and did they sort of encourage you to find a different career path, maybe?
Well, I'll have to tell you another interesting story along those lines. About a week or 2 weeks after we got picked up in Hawaii and then we came back, and we had a big press conference, of course. And all the NASA people came in, all the reporters came in, and TV people and stuff like that. And a lot of the families came in to listen to the whole thing. And we're in the auditorium down at the Johnson Space Center. So we started talking about that. And in the beginning of the conference, a reporter asked, Jim, are you going to ask for another flight? I mean, obviously this was not, successful. And before that, on Apollo 11s and I think 12, management said, look, if there's a problem with this flight, we'll get you back and we'll give you the very next one. And so when that question came up from the reporter, I thought to myself, because management was right behind us, here is the perfect opportunity to put them on the wall, and said yes, because they did not talk to us, the 13, just 11 and 12. And I was about ready to say something like that when out in the audience, I saw a hand go up. And then I saw it go down like this. It was my wife. She said, I could tell. I said, no, I think this is the last flight I'm going to make.
That was good, Jim. I've never heard that one before. Thank you.
Yep.
That's good.
We're done.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
Great. Jim,
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
Thank you so much, Jim.
You got
It's always
everything?
a pleasure.
That's good.